Cool.
Hello and welcome to this week's True Crime Special here on PFP Media. I'm going to tone it down just a little bit because this isn't going to be a crazy pod. The idea of this is just to have a bit of fun and do something a little bit different to the normal football-based content that we normally churn out on a Monday morning. It's a Friday afternoon. I've got a drink here with me. I think Joe's on some sort of cold beverage as well.
Yeah, I'm drinking an iced coffee. It might have something else in it, and it might not be in an iced coffee glass. It might be in a martini glass, but we'll call it an iced coffee.
You've just shown me off screen there, Joe, that you have a Guinness keeping cold. If you're watching the video here, you might enjoy what Joe's got. Maybe he can give a description of what he's holding.
Yeah, so I have here a Dunn Stores freezer bag, and in it, if I can put it up to the camera, maybe not. Well, anyway, in it I have a bag of ice, a can of Guinness, and a Guinness pint glass. So it's effectively my very own carry fridge in the hand that I can just carry around, and it'd be very useful for when I finish my espresso martini and I want to dive into a gorgeous pint of Guinness like Rafe is doing right now.
So we said that we do something different. We've talked about this on the football show for a few weeks now, and we've been teasing people with this, the idea of a true crime special. Now, Joe, I left it down to you to come up with the subject matter for this. I don't know if we want to reveal straight away what we're going to do. Maybe do you want to talk about why we decided to do something a bit different?
Yeah, I suppose for me, I don't like football anymore. I mean, that's a bit over the top. I do like football. I suppose the thing is we both have other interests and we both like talking. I think anyone who is blatantly clear that anyone who has a podcast likes the sound of their own voice. That's an accusation that's definitely been labeled at Rafe and myself over the years by our wider friend circle and our better halves. And this is just a really nice opportunity while we both have a bit of extra time to talk about something that you don't usually hear us talking about. And we were kind of thinking, do we want to make it political? Do we want to talk about current affairs? And that's a very specific and perhaps dangerous road to go down.
And it's also boring for a lot of people, Matt.
It is boring for a lot of people. And I think for me, one of the things that I like about the best podcast, and for me, the best podcast is the Joe Rogan Experience, because for me, it's effectively the Beatles of podcasts because it's simultaneously the best and the most popular, which is very rare. But Rogan, what makes Rogan so good is that he gets such a diverse group of people on, and that he doesn't really have a definitive type of podcast. And the one that we stumbled upon the other day fits into the true crime model that we wanted to start with. And by no means is this going to be the only extra podcast that we do. It's what we've chosen to start with, and basically, Rafe, I think we just want to have some fun with it, don't we, and spend some more time together in a virtual setting.
Now, you initially gave me a few suggestions, Joe. You suggested some form of Robin Hood robberies and some Lego conspiracies.
Yeah, the Robin Hood robbery, I think I talked about on the football podcast before. Was that the one where the guys in Milan scaled the elite apartment block and robbed jewelry and then went back down? And then there's the Lego story. I can't remember what city that was in. I think it might have been Paris. Yeah, where someone there'd been a theft of Lego, and it had some sort of significance. But I mean, once I stumbled across this story, I immediately knew that we had to use it, and without me saying to you that we had to use it, that was your initial response as well. It was like, that's the one. It's just such a unique story, and it's absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to get into it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we might as well introduce it. So, the man, I suppose, that we're going to be talking about, the stimulus for the conversation, is a guy named Michael Scott Moore. Joe, do you want to tell us a little bit about Michael?
So, as far as I'm aware, Michael Scott Moore is an American journalist based out of Berlin. And going back about 10 years, he had stumbled across a story involving Somali pirates who had captured a German ship in the Gulf of Aden or somewhere around the Horn of Africa where they would have been based, but then they got captured and they've been on trial in Berlin in Germany, and he'd been covering it as a reporter, but then he wanted to write a book, delving into Somali pirates and bringing their story to the Western world, because when we hear of Somalia, we just associate them with pirates, but perhaps we don't, modern day piracy, but perhaps we don't know why this is so prevalent there, and what are the exact socio-economic conditions that Somalis are living under. So he went to Somalia with another guy, another journalist, and they hired local security, and they were there for 10 days. And on the 10th day, after he had just
it ended happily at that stage. It was a happy ever after, a happy a happy ever after. He went home happily to his family, and that's the end of the show.
And he wrote his book, and it was a bestseller. The end. Not quite. His friend got away. He dropped his friend off at the airport, and then as he was going back to his car, an SUV full of lads with Kalashnikovs pulled up, and he was swiftly pulled out of his car and put into this new car, and he was held captive in various places in Somalia for 2 years and 8 months. Before a ransom of $1.6 million was paid, and he was able to walk away a free man. Just insane. And I think from my perspective, he must be in a real minority in the world of people who are held captive in these situations and actually live, for a variety of reasons. But I mean, being able to walk away from this situation is very rare,
especially when you consider the time that he was held captive. I mean, he was in captivity for 977 days. I mean, he says himself that after the first year he gave up all hope of ever returning back to his life and back to his family. And I mean, that's just absolutely mad. Like, to think that you could be gone for that period of time. Now, you might ask, why did it take 2 years and 10 months for that ransom to be paid? And it's because the Somalis up to that point were demanding $20 million for him for no apparent reason. And it was only towards the very end, when I think the crew almost got fed up of holding him, and he started to have some health issues, that they finally decided to renegotiate the price. But this is what makes it so mad. Like, obviously, being kidnapped and being captured is everybody's worst nightmare, but being held for 2 years and 10 months is just incredible.
Yeah, it is. I think that one of the reasons they had that ransom at $20 million was because their peers, if you will, the ones who are out there capturing freighters, you typically be able to get a huge amount of money. You're in the tens of millions off of a shipping company through their insurance for a ship. So when they capture an American, they kind of translate that to Western product, Western money. So I think that's kind of the reason why they were demanding so much. And he also mentioned that there are 2 other people who are being held captive, who are actually rescued with the U.S. Marine Corps, who were oh no, sorry, it was 2 other people, two African people from Seychelles, who were captured, and they were valued at 10 million each. So he had another theory that maybe it was for the American, they doubled that. But in any case, for a journalist, not a celebrity, for just a regular guy to be demanding $20 million, I think it just shows kind of the lack of professionalism, if you will, that they weren't the most sophisticated criminals.
Okay, well, let's take a step back from his story for a minute, and let's strip this right down to the beginning. We haven't really decided how we're going to structure this podcast. We're just going to talk and see where it takes us. But let's look at Somalia for a second. There'll be people out there that genuinely have no idea where Somalia is, or any sort of its, geographical or political background. I mean, it's you're the politics student, Joe. Do you want to give us a brief summary of Somalian history in the 20th century? Really brief.
Very brief. So Somalia is in the east coast of Africa, neighboring Ethiopia to the west, Kenya to the north, and it would have been under Italian control in the 20th century. Italy had colonies in the eastern part of Africa. It's a Muslim country, like the majority of the north of Africa, and it's extremely poor. So there's very, very, very little excuse me, my microphone dropped. There's very, very little infrastructure there. There, there's very little civil service. There's very little legal business. I think one of the things that Joe Rogan actually was able to get across very well in the podcast was that these guys are effectively businessmen. It's an illicit business, and two of the main paths for young men, because there is a significant military in Somalia, are to go and join Al Shabaab, which is the main terrorist group there. They're affiliated with Al Qaeda, or to become pirates, because they would have had a lot of young men have a background in military training. So those are two possible avenues. But that aside, the absolute majority of Somalis get by on less than $1 a day, and there's just no infrastructure. There's no jobs. They don't. It's incomparable to how we live life in the Western world.
Outside of major capital cities in Africa, this is something I've spoken at length about to one of my friends, or our friends, even Joe, who's done a lot of work with the UN and a lot of peace projects in Mozambique and in Africa. Like the corruption levels in Africa are absolutely insane, and I don't mean to generalize, and I'm not having a pop at African people, but structurally and fundamentally, like when Africa was divided up by European colonialists post-World War, there was no thought given to how these countries would manage themselves down the line. So, I mean, outside of the main municipal district of the cities, the governments and the police force have very little say as to what goes on. So we're talking about Somalia here, and it's these pirate groups as they become known. Look, they're not really pirates. We'll talk a bit about why they have that name and what goes on at sea, but they're gangsters, or they're organized crime. But they do also run towns, cities, and villages around Somalia, and they provide the infrastructure and they provide the jobs, and they are the police, and they are accountable for the people of those towns and cities. They're pirate towns or gangster towns, essentially, and it's very different. So, I mean, like you said there, you've got the choice. If you don't want to look after sheep on the side of a mountain for 70 cents a day, your only two options are to get involved in some form of crime, and it's just money. And as Michael Scott Moore says, he sympathized almost with a lot of the lower ranking guys that he spent time with. Not all of them. He said about half of the people that he interacted with were quite sympathetic towards him, and he actually developed some form of human connection with these guys, and he started to understand who they were and where they came from. Lots of them didn't want to do this forever. They wanted out of it. They just wanted to make some money so that they could have a better life at one stage or another.
Yeah, he also said that they often left AK-47s lying around, and he was half minded to pick one up and start firing at everyone. So obviously there's mixed emotions there. But I think, I mean, it'd be difficult to be in that situation and not, to get to know a country like Somalia, see the systemic poverty, the complete lack of opportunity for anyone. And this is, like, as we're saying, this is one of two routes, along with a terrorist organization, where you can get in, you can work your way up, and you can actually make some money. And that's it. And, so I think people have to be able to understand that these guys aren't evil. This is these are the options that they have available if they don't want to have a terrible life economically. I mean, they'll still have a bad life economically, but it'd be considerably better than if they were herding sheep for 50 cents a day or whatever it is.
Like we said, they're known as pirates because obviously they have a reputation for capturing ships at sea and holding the crew and the cargo ransom. Now, this was actually quite a noble thing that they started doing in the early 90s after the collapse of the government. Because there was no navy patrolling the seas, the boats of local militia would go out to guard the waters from foreign fishermen stealing their fish. And even it came out after the tsunami in 2004 that the Italian mafia had been dumping waste off the Somali coast and off the Horn of Africa illegally. Lots of this washed up with the tsunami, and it became apparent that nobody was looking after these waters. So they would go and they'd find fishing ships that were there illegally or whoever it was, and they detain these ships and they demand basically a license fee that they pay for what they're taking before they release them. And this slowly evolved into, you know, capturing bigger ships that crossed through, and eventually giant cargo ships before they were all armed with you know, personal security and stuff like this. So it was quite a noble thing originally, and it was very kind of I don't know what the word for it is, but it was in the national interest and in the interest of the people at the beginning to do this. And it evolved into all sorts of other things along with, you know, drugs trade, weapons trade, and, you know, the trade of people. This is what it evolved into, and this is what's become more popular since, you know, these ships have become more protected. We don't hear really anything about Somali pirates anymore. This was in 2012 that he was captured, and since kind of 2013, 14, it's heavily kind of declined.
Yeah, this is it. That is not, it's not something that's happened, and this is something that Michael Scott Moore said on the podcast himself, was that he went there to write a story on this, and then he became the story. And since he got out, that story and his ability to write the story he wanted to write wasn't possible. But I mean, this is just it's a forgotten country. Like a lot of countries in Africa, it's and around the world, it's a forgotten country where there's very little hope. And I mean, these people don't really have another option, do they, Rafe, than to go into a life of crime. But I suppose the wider question then for people like ourselves to be asking, and anyone who's interested in these sort of topics, is that because I don't believe that this is an issue that the Somalia can solve itself. I think that if it was, then perhaps it would have been solved already. But again, Somalia is a relatively young country, so to speak, with everything going against it. But you have to wonder, are organizations like the United Nations doing enough to help Africa? But it goes beyond the United Nations, obviously.
Again, another great stat from that Joe Rogan show was that I think only 1% of the world take home more than $30,000 a year. And, you know, we look at this from Europe and we think, oh my God, look at these people and what they're doing. But it's a totally different perspective outside of where we come from and how we see it. So look, I don't, we're going down a very sympathetic path for these guys. And let's not forget, let's come back to the story a little bit, because this 10 days into his trip to Somalia, Michael Scott Moore, you know, he was dragged out of his car. He was beaten with guns. He had his glasses smashed. He couldn't see for most of the time that he was in captivity. He had his wrist broken straight away, you know. And like these guys, they're nasty people that are doing it. You know, they're not all friendly. And he said he sympathized to a degree with up to half the people. But like you said, he also regularly contemplated opening fire on them and sacrificing his own life, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. We have been far too sympathetic, and that's because we're coming at it from a sympathetic background. We're thinking, you know, we've been coming at it purely from a socioeconomic perspective, and thinking, you know, that there's really no route apart from piracy or terrorism for these guys to go down. And of course, that's not true. You know, there are other things you could be doing, but it's not easy. And these are the easy routes, and these are the routes where you have your peers. So there'll be peer pressure to join up with these organizations. And I think if one thing they're saying, if you want to take a wife, it's seen as very manly to go and partake in piracy or in terrorism.
If you're looking at my screen, you might see that I'm holding up a USB input cable here.
Did you forget to plug in your microphone?
Yeah, my microphone is not. I'm still talking into it, even though it's not plugged in. So hopefully the audio quality from my end is. I
did notice it wasn't the same as usual.
Well,
but
maybe you could have spoken up then, Joey.
I think I was too interested in drinking my drinks, Rafe.
Hello, the True Crime Special. I hope that sounds a little bit better.
Oh, that is much better. That is much better. We digress. Where were we? I had just been we were just about to say that basically it's not the only path for these young men to go down, and that it doesn't excuse this sort of behavior is not acceptable.
No, and look, like you said,
Um,
these guys are gangsters at the end of the day. Like
and
Michael Scott Moore
I
described being driven around in luxury SUVs the whole time, with the guys bragging about the worth of their weapons. And
that's another thing. Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, wearing 500 bullet vests, and a bullet would be, what did he say, $1?
yeah,
So that's effectively their bling. And then they had the latest smartphones. So I mean, they're not spending their money in the right way. They
no,
are
and
gangsters. They're
there's
showing off that
also
they have.
there's also a massive drugs problem within Somali culture and culture in that part of the world. What's the plant called? Cat. Yeah, it's essentially a chewable plant that will get you nice and high, and it's a stimulant, but there's a nasty crash afterwards. So you basically get up, you start chewing this shit all day, until you got a bit of a buzz on, you crash at night, and you get up and you repeat it. And it's an incredibly expensive habit. And that's essentially, like we talk about, these underdogs coming up from, working class Somalia, trying to find, they are all drug addicts at the end of the day, and that, not all of Somalia, but this pirate culture, they sit around, they eat this shit all day. They get them really agitated, they fight with each other. They knock the head off each other. They're really rude, really irritable. And then they pass out at the end of the day and they get up and do it again. They're all of this piracy. Like obviously there's massive amounts of cash that are getting funneled into really disturbing, human trafficking channels. And the rest of it gets spent on weapons and drugs. Like,
The part that shocked me the most was the human trafficking, when they started talking about the other side of the business. I mean, the arms, I think they're not, I don't know, I think they're not maybe that involved in arms. It's more bringing arms into the country, perhaps passing them to into Ethiopia or something. But when they started talking about sending people up to Libya, that was pretty disturbing. Yeah, that was pretty disturbing.
People would look for a safe passage into Libya or into Sudan to get out of Somalia, because Somalia is an awful place to be. And like people are thinking like, wait, hang on, you're a refugee and you want to go to Libya or you want to go to Sudan. And like, this is how bad Somalia is and how bad the living conditions are. Like that's their idea of prosperity, is to get into Libya. Like, but so that they'll pay these pirates or these traffickers to get them across the border, and they'll willingly climb into the back of these trucks and the back of these vans. But then once they cross the border, they suddenly become prisoners and captives, and they end up being sold off at slave auctions, down the same routes that slavery has always had in that part of the world. And it's the same that we see with, poor Eastern Europeans and poor Asians and poor Africans coming into Europe and coming into Britain. They all come looking for safe passage. They all come voluntarily and willingly, and they actually pay to come here. But then when they get out of the lorry at the other side, they're not being given passports and being set up with jobs. They're being bundled into brothels or being sold off to the highest bidder. And so I mean, that's really dark to think about, and things could definitely be worse. Like, he was fed every day, and I'm not saying he made friends with these captors, but I mean, a lot of people end up much worse off than poor old Michael Scott. Like,
yeah, I think, like I said at the start of there are just so many ways in just over 900 days that you would die in those conditions. I mean, being killed because the ransom isn't being paid, they could have easily killed him. It's more expensive to keep him alive after that amount of time. Killing himself, dying because of health reasons. I mean, at the end, he said he developed a fairly serious skin disease, lost over 60 pounds in body weight. And I mean, he doesn't look like a particularly heavy guy on the Joe Rogan Experience either.
He had a lung infection, he had an ear infection, he had stuff coming up all over his skin. Like,
I mean, without antibiotics, it's very easy to die from a run-of-the-mill ear infection or any type of infection.
Even exhaustion and heat stroke. If you're malnourished and you're in a clay hut in Somalia and the sun's getting into it, or wherever you are, You
know what else? Especially psychologically, after he made that decision after a year, and he did say because that for him was the only way that he could keep going. But when you psychologically check out and you don't have anything to hope for, then I think that has ramifications for your physiological state as well.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about how he got by for a minute, but he says that there was a 5-month period that just after the first year where he essentially gave up hope, but it was also the best 5 months of his captivity when he was on board this ship. He was taken from land and put onto a recently seized, cargo ship.
It was a Chinese vessel with tons of Chinese food, which they all ate.
But there was workers from all over Southeast Asia on it, from Indonesia, from China, from all sorts of places. 28 of these workers. Now, these guys, Joe, were held for 5 years. 5 years before they were eventually freed, which is we talk about 2 years and 10 months is crazy. But I mean, 5 years is just mad. But imagine, okay, so you're Michael Scott, you've been held for a year in Somalia, and the negotiations are ongoing with your family the whole time. You're thinking maybe the Navy SEALs are coming for me. And then all of a sudden you're put in the back of this SUV, you're driven to, you don't know where, you end up at a dock and you're loaded onto this ship full of Asian prisoners. And you sail out to sea. How are you feeling?
I think you've described perhaps one of the absolute worst case scenarios anyone could possibly describe. The fact that he said that was the best period shows how terrible the rest of his time was. Imagine that you're you're taking off land onto it, man. They could have been going anywhere.
To clarify, I think it was the best period because firstly the food was better, and also because he had some company. He was on his own more or less, aside from his guards, while he was on land. But there were 5 of the crew spoke English. They were Indonesian, and they developed what he referred to as a pidgin language. That was part Chinese, part English, that people could communicate with each other. They slept in dorms with 10 people, rather than being chained up in a bed under a mosquito net by himself. I know you're on a ship, but it makes a difference.
I think the camaraderie and the fact that, how did he describe the food when he was on land? It was plain boiled goat and boiled beans, plain.
Yeah,
I think that was what he was eating. I mean, to have a bit of Chinese rice and something with a bit of flavor would do you the world of good. And I think most importantly, man, the company.
Oh yeah, certainly.
To realize that you're not in it alone, to see that people are surviving for longer periods than you've been there, and to know that the more time you're there, I suppose the more the greater the chance of the US Navy or the US Marines coming and getting you, and knowing that they had recently rescued 2 people in a very similar location as well.
Yeah, but I don't think he knew that they had been rescued. He said that the pirates told him that the hostages had been killed.
That's true. Apologies, that's true. He only found out they'd been rescued afterwards, and then he developed a relationship with them. Yeah, the hostage, his guards told him that they'd been killed. That was something that I found very interesting, is the spin that the pirates used to kind of talk themselves up and to make it seem like to the hostages like they were much more successful than they actually were. And I think I mentioned it at the start of the show. They really came across as extremely amateur.
Yeah, and I think
across the board.
That's what he says himself, that they started with this $20 million, reward. What is it? What's the word I'm looking for? $20 million ransom. At the start. And it's $20 million, and there was no rhyme or reason to that figure. This guy was just a journalist from Los Angeles. Where was this 20 million going to come from? The US government were not paying 20 million for one man and his safety. His family did not have that kind of money. His work did not have that kind of money. And they just kind of left him. They're like, oh yeah, well, pay it or we'll keep him. And he was kept for just a crazy amount of time until he ended up on his last legs. And he said that some of the crew were threatening to go on strike after a while because they were fed up of detaining him. They're like, why are we still keeping this guy? They're not paying us $20 million. It's been nearly 3 years, lads. Like, come on. So like you said at the start, he wasn't a giant cargo ship full. He wasn't worth that much in terms of goods. The insurance wasn't going to cover that because that he wasn't worth that to anybody. Like there was no company that's like, they've got $50 million worth of our stock, it's worth our while to pay 20 million to get it back. Like, you know, this rationale never happened anywhere.
I think it shows how uneducated they are, and how you know, it's a very tough subject to talk about, but I'm going to say you have to understand the asset that you have. And he was an asset for them, and they didn't understand his background. I mean, they all had smartphones. They could have Googled, but I suppose for them, if they're Googling him and he comes up and he has, you know, a verified Twitter account because he's a journalist or something like that, they see that he's living in Berlin and he's writing these books. Perhaps it would be only natural if they thought that he had a lot of money, but you know, a journalist doesn't make a lot of money. I mean, they can make they can make a decent living, but not the amount of money that they're talking about. That's just, it's a different kettle of fish. So they didn't understand it. They don't know what those numbers mean, man, is what I'm trying to say. And I hope I'm not coming across as harsh, but I really don't think they know what $20 million is.
They remind me of some football club owners, Joe, that are incredibly reluctant to let go of some of their players, you know, that are no longer playing for their team, and
Yes.
that they want to move, and other clubs want to buy them, but they say, no, we need this much money for them. And everyone, why that much? It doesn't make any sense. You can't just demand a massive profit for somebody that's not worth that much money, you know. And I don't know.
I can think of a few football clubs that come to mind that fit that mold.
Yeah, but
unfortunately,
we're not we're not doing football though.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
I suppose the other side of it, we've looked at it from his point of view. We'll come back to him in a minute, and we've looked at it from the Pirates' point of view. The other side of it is his family, man, at home. You know, and that's what he said was the hardest part. Like he thought about taking on the Somalis to get out, and he knew it would cost him his life if he picked up that gun, because he might take out 6 or 7 of them, but there was always another 10. You know, then half of them were awake and half of them were asleep, and he'd get killed eventually. He thought about turning the gun on himself because it would put his family, it would stop the suffering for them. You know, they wouldn't be worrying about him every day. He wouldn't be putting the lives of, you know, any rescue teams at risk or anything like this, you know. And like, it must be incredibly difficult for those people. Like, you think about journalists traveling all over the world and the risks that they take to report on these stories. But yeah,
I think for me, that's the next question. That's the next thing that I'd like to discuss is it worth it? But I think the answer has to be yes.
Well, he got home, you know, he sees his mum now, and they're going for drives, and they both appreciate life considerably more in the present.
99 times out of 100, he gets killed or he dies some way. When I mean, is it worth it? I think that this is, man, he knew the risks. He knew the risks. I don't want to be coming across as harsh. He hired a local security team because he knew the risks. There's every chance that you get. I wouldn't do it.
He says himself, he'd gone to report in the Gaza Strip. He traveled to northern Iraq to do stories there. Like this is a guy who regularly took his life into his own hands to report on what are absolutely crazy news stories, you know. And he was playing with fire to a degree.
But we need these news stories. I think. I mean, this. I think this is one of the most amazing things about the modern world is that how. I mean, this doesn't really fall into the category of globalization because it's not, you know, one country merging with another for economic benefits or you know, there's nothing to do with trade. It's independent journalists risking their lives to go and report in and on some of the most inaccessible places in the world. I mean, who would go to Iraq or right now Syria or to Libya or to North Korea or, you know, Iran, all of these places? It takes a huge amount of courage to decide that you're going to go as a journalist, as a Western journalist, and report from one of these places. But if people didn't, then we wouldn't know exactly what was going on. We wouldn't have information about what are perceived to be inaccessible parts of the world.
It's not just the journalists though that get kidnapped. Like there was these Asian fishermen that were kidnapped, and there are local fishermen that get kidnapped, and there are even local people that get kidnapped. And kidnapping is a massive problem around the world. And Somalia and the pirates have a reputation for it. But if you look at South America, or if you look across Africa or the Middle East or wherever, like kidnapping it's horrible, man. Like imagine getting that phone call randomly to say that one of your loved ones is gone until you can come up with a massive sum of money. And then even if you come up with the money, there's no guarantee that you get them back.
And my wife's brother got kidnapped. I'm sure I told you that in the past. Absolutely, in Mexico, absolutely mental. You're completely right. Anywhere where there's systemic poverty, there's money to be made from that sort of behavior. And I think especially if you're white in these places, you're perceived to have money. I don't mean, fair enough, you have more money than the people who are kidnapping you, but at the end of the day,
but in Michael Scott's case here, did he have more money than the gang that kidnapped him?
Yeah, well, did he have 10 Land Rovers and 100 new iPhones and etc.? I don't know. I'd imagine he would have a decent amount of, I'm not saying he's rich, I'd imagine he could look after himself.
If he's a journalist living in Berlin, he's got like 10 grand in his bank account, maybe himself, maybe a bit more. Maybe he owns a house worth a couple $100 grand. But I mean, man, if these guys are demanding $20 million ransoms for shit, if they take out a ship or a person or anything, and they can demand even 1 million for anything once ever, that's more money than most people will ever make or have in their life. Like,
agreed. Yeah.
So there does come a point where, like I said, we identified with these guys a bit at the start, coming from their poor backgrounds, but the leaders of these gangs, man, and that's what they are. They're gangs, and the leaders of these gangs are incredibly rich. We've
incredibly selfish as well.
We've all seen Captain Phillips, and it's funny because he says that, the guards were all watching Captain Phillips on their phone, and he got to see a bit of it while he was over there. He watched Captain Phillips while he was a prisoner in Somalia, which is insane. But we've all seen that scene at the start where, Captain Phillips, there's 100 grand in the safe or 10 grand in the safe or whatever it is. Take that, and your man's like, I don't need that. I have $50 million in my bank account at home. The leader of the gang. This isn't about money. This is what we do. This isn't about your money. Like, there's a crazy amount of money tied up in this.
This is a crazy thing. And obviously you mentioned earlier on that certainly a lot of these coastal towns and cities in Somalia are controlled by these gangs who are effectively known as pirates. But the money doesn't get spread out evenly among society. It would be kind of more, it wouldn't be more acceptable, because this is not a correct way to be in any way means an ethical way to be making money. But I think the fact that the money doesn't get spread out among society is even worse. And I think that kind of should end any sympathy that we might have, right, for these young men. We don't have sympathy for the older ones, for the bosses. We have sympathy for the young ones who don't really see any other path. And I wouldn't really call it sympathy, but maybe understanding is a better word.
Well, you talk about sympathy with these guys, and at the end of the Joe Rogan pod, the probably the most mind-blowing thing, Michael says that he gets contacted on Facebook by one of the guys, one of his captors, one of the guys who he would have spoken to a lot, one of the more sympathetic pirates, actually reaches out to him and sends him a message, and that's just absolutely insane.
I mean, I would get freaked off enough if I got like a message of someone that I used to know way back, and like
somebody from school, that exactly. You haven't spoken to in 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like, oh, hold on a second, but someone who actively held you prisoner for almost 3 years, and who was part of a gang that were treating you like that for so long. It's absolutely. But the thing that really struck me was that they communicate, they correspond, they
Yeah, I
have
mean,
a relationship. He didn't accept his friend request, but they chat via Facebook Messenger.
yeah, the fact that he engaged him, he didn't even just block him straight away or, report him to the FBI or whatever, he read his message and thought about it and sent him back a message. And whether like that message wasn't like, hey man, what's going on? Miss you loads or whatever. But like you said, the fact that there is correspondence there is just,
But
I
he was
don't know,
saying
man.
that this is what he was saying was that the junior guards, that he was almost friends with them, that he
I
considered them
don't think he
half.
went that far.
It was all like that. Joe Rogan directly asked him, "Did you make friends with them?" And he said, "Yeah, with some of them, it was almost like that." I don't think he didn't go that far to say they were his friends, but they could talk together. Do you know what I mean? They could get on. It'd be like getting on with your prison guards, I suppose. You wouldn't be friends with them. They'd still be controlling you and not, do you know what I mean? But you would be able to have a conversation with them.
He spoke about how hard it was to readapt to society, to Western society after that. And look, I know it's not a direct comparison, but it reminded me of people coming out of prison, man,
Absolutely.
And when you hear Michael talk about it, you have a lot of sympathy for Michael because he wasn't a bank robber, or he wasn't a rapist or a murderer, or he hadn't committed
or a pirate,
or he hadn't committed some sort of horrible crime, So you thought, oh God, this poor guy or whatever. But when you hear about how it now, look, obviously the conditions that he were in are considerably worse than the conditions in most Western countries in terms of prisons. But the idea of coming out and, not being able to settle in social environments, not being able to read social cues, feeling anxious in large public spaces because you're hyper vigilant, is there are too many people here, who's looking at me? Is someone gonna attack me? I can't see behind me. And that in some of the more dangerous prisons, that this is a real mentality that people would get into. And, coming out, you do wonder how beneficial it is to lock anybody up in a prison, because if they're going to get out at some stage, they're only going to be in a worse mental state than when they went in.
Well, I think that's well, it's very relevant to the discussion that we're having. Both of us are quite liberal with our views on the prison system and punishment. However, there are definitely people in society who are a danger to the rest of the population and have no right, have committed actions that lead the state with no other option but to lock them away for the rest of their lives. I mean,
I'm talking about people that are getting reintroduced to society after 2 or 3 years. They're being sent in, surrounded by other criminals, and expected to come out a better person.
But this is the thing, is that prison sentences like that, and just being in there inside, and obviously we don't know what that's like, but
it's different in different countries and in different prisons.
It is, but there are so many different ways in which you can get radicalized inside. You could become an Islamic terrorist. You could become very well acquainted with local drug gangs. You could, befriend any sort of degenerate person who would lead you to what I'm basically trying to say is that a prison sentence or a punishment needs to be reformative. That has to be the absolute. That has to be the aim of any form of punishment. Is that, how do we make sure that, first of all, this person doesn't do this act again, commit an act like this again? But the way that prison sentences are structured is that let's punish them as severely as possible, and then we'll just reintroduce them to society. And that punishment, in their mind, it'll be enough to make them never commit an act like that again. But as we both know, Rafe, for most people, that's only the beginning. And you might get tossed in, you might get put in jail for, a minor, a theft, or getting in a fight and knocking someone out and you could get arrested for that and put in prison for
Or
that.
non-violent drug offenses.
A non-violent drug offense, exactly. You could be holding for someone else. Someone could have left something in a place in your house, and you know what I mean. Anything, and from then on, it's just a domino effect, and you just keep on picking up more offenses, and you become a repeat offender. The emphasis has to be on taking care of these people while they're inside, but when they get out, absolutely making sure that they reacclimatize. And there has to be paths when people are in, and we've got onto prison now, not kidnapping, but in prison there have to be paths for people to pursue apprenticeships and qualifications, and to be able to go directly into employment when they get out, and to remove the stigma around having a criminal record.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with all of that. Like Michael says that he passed his time once he accepted, that he wasn't getting out again, that he stopped waiting for it to be rescued the next day or waiting for a deal to be done after the first year or so. He started writing books in his head and memorizing passages. And, he did 2 hours of what he called writing every day, even though he didn't have a pen and paper for most of the time. I mean, I think that's incredible. Obviously, you have to do something with your thoughts. You can't just stare at a wall thinking, wow, those bricks are red or whatever it is. Like your mind goes somewhere. But as a writer, like he was, like, I mean, it's obviously an incredible story, and he spoke really, really well. And he has a book out on it if anybody's interested in reading it. It's called The Desert and the Sea, 977 Days in Captivity. And I'd probably go and read it now, to be honest, after listening to him speak for an hour and a half on Joe Rogan, because it's an incredible story, and I'd love to hear how he's actually written it after all this time and how he has put it together. But it shows you that, like, no matter what kind of adversity you're coming up against, you can learn from anything, man, and you can make something out of something bad, like, and I like that part of it.
I liked it as well, and I thought that was great because he's a writer. He didn't have. I think it just showed how much of a writer he is and what being a writer actually is that he didn't have the tools to work about his craft, but he memorized prose in his head, like pages. And then when he eventually got pen and paper, he said that he remembered it all. I mean, man, it shows how strong the human mind is. It is impossible for us to comprehend that. I can't think about that. 2 years and 8 months in a Somali, not even prison, being held captive by Somali pirates in a variety of locations. I mean, who else living to tell the tale? You'd count on one hand the amount of people who have been in that situation the modern world.
And then, man, the number of people that would want to come out and talk about it afterwards. Like, I mean, like that would ruin most people. Most people would never leave their house again, they just turn to alcoholism or drugs or whatever it was and just lock themselves away and spiral off into like an absurd depression. But
he had to. He's a writer, and he went there to write a story about Somali pirates. And that story ended up becoming himself, but he fulfilled his purpose of going to Somalia.
It's interesting talking about piracy. That, look, like we said, it's not such a big issue anymore in Somalia. They've shifted their focus more towards weapons and people or whatever it is, which is lovely. But he was saying that he became interested in the story in Germany because of the law situation over there, that because Germany itself is such a newly formed state, that there were no laws really regarding piracy in the constitution. And even though it was the Dutch Navy that captured these guys that initially drew his attention, the Dutch wanted absolutely nothing to do with prosecuting them. They said, look, we're only going to intervene for you guys if you're going to be the ones prosecuting them, because we're not dealing with them. He said that the people that were convicted in those trials for whatever it was, attempting to ambush this cargo ship, got an average of 7 years. And then they all went back to Somalia safely. And most of them probably just returned to a life of organized crime. And you kind of wonder, like, I know we spoke about prisons a minute ago, but you kind of wonder what the point of that is,
I don't think there's any point. I mean, what it shows to the shipping country that we're on your side as the state that you pay taxes in, and anyway, these people who stole your product or your, part of your company are going to be punished by us. So that's the message it sends, that we've got your back. That being said, what good does it do to those men? They're and going back to some, what good does it do? Would it do them better to grant them? Well, I suppose you can't grant them citizenship to Germany. That's they committed insanity.
I was thinking, I know a liberal, but that's a bit like, hey, good.
No. I wasn't. I was. We're doing a podcast. We're having a chat about it. That's something that popped into my head. That's not something I believe. That's not something that I think. Even I'm supposed to be the conservative of the two of us. Man, I lost my train of thought with that brain fart. I like. How does that benefit Somalia? That they're gone? They're just going to be more people coming in filling their shoes.
An endless supply of people coming in. You know.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So look, we could, I suppose, sit here all day talking about how we could solve the problem of piracy in Africa, but that's a whole completely other political debate that I think most people don't really want to hear. About. Do people want to hear about the political issues in Africa, man? I don't know that they do. People came here for the pirates, man. we promised them a true crime story. We promised them, a crazy story, and I think we've more or less delivered on that.
Yeah, I agree. It's an utterly unique story, and it'll be hard to top this one. But I'm going to be actively researching for next month's edition of this podcast.
Have we got a name for the true crime podcast yet, or will we just call it the PFP True Crime Podcast?
I think we'll just call it the PFP. PFP Media True Crime Podcast. I think that's what we'll call it. Episode 1.
Okay. Well, look, this has been the PFP Media True Crime Podcast, Episode 1. The focus on Michael Scott Moore and the Somali Pirates. His book is The Desert and the Sea, 977 Days in Captivity. I don't know if you want to order it, Joe, and I can just borrow it from you when you're finished, because I'm a bit cheap like that, or if I might have to, get Hannah to buy it, recommend it to her, and then read it when she's finished.
Well, Hannah likes true crime, doesn't she?
She does, and she likes reading books as well. She's very impressive that way. So I might have to do that. But I will read that book at some stage, because I am really looking forward to it. And to be honest, Joe, great shout. I've really enjoyed talking about it. I've really enjoyed listening to it earlier. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely. And thanks for listening, guys. We're excited to do this, and it won't be as regular as the football one, but it'll be as regular as we can make it.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, thanks, and we will see you next time.